Well, it's almost 2 years since Russia invaded Ukraine, sparking a war that's left many thousands dead and injured on both sides. Now, last month, an Australian clinical psychologist who specialises in treating trauma arising from war and natural disasters was invited to conduct seminars with members of the Ukrainian government, including President Zelensky's staff. Zelensky's wife is patron for mental health in Ukraine, and Dr Robi Sonderegger was asked to train them on how best to work with a population traumatised by tragedy. Dr Robi Sonderegger is joining me now. Thanks for coming onto the program, Dr Robi. But when we think of people living in war zones, I guess we automatically think of the physical toll, but there's obviously a huge psychological toll as well. So how does war affect the psyche of people?
Thanks, James. Great to chat with you. Look, people respond to the tragedy of war in a variety of different ways. For example, two people can experience the exact same tragedy, and yet one person can be deeply traumatized and another relatively okay. In fact, another person can experience a near-death encounter and be relatively resilient in response to it, whereas another person can just witness that near-death encounter and experience signs and symptoms of post-traumatic stress. But look, beyond all of the, signs and symptoms of classic, anxiety, depression, sleepless nights, flashbacks and nightmares that typically go along with trauma, trauma has this interesting way of coming back to bite you later on down the track. So if we don't intervene, if we don't treat it right, it can later on down the track affect your work and productivity, even your relationships. But when despair and hopelessness kicks in, well, that's when you kind of want to give up. And when a nation is at war, hey, giving up is not part of the equation that you want when a nation is still trying to conquer you.
You've done similar training in war zones around the world, in Africa and the Middle East. How does the conflict in Ukraine differ from other places where you've worked and given advice?
Yeah, look, some conflicts obviously are more brutal than others. Some go on for longer than others. Some get more media attention than others. But at the end of the day, tragedy is tragedy. Loss is loss. Grief is grief. As somebody I know once said, in fact, I think it was you, said, look, the only experience or qualification you need in order to have some kind of tragedy take place in your life is simply to be born. In other words, no one is immune to this stuff. But when it comes to the Ukrainians, it's amazing. They have this sense of resilience, which is spectacular. It's almost unprecedented that when the sirens go off, the shops close down, when the air raid siren is over, shops open back up again and everyone seems to go on. It's amazing to see. And resilience it's not just emotional strength, but rather it's more of an emotional flexibility, kind of like, as the saying goes, that which does not bend will break. And so when the storm blows, the question of how able we are to bend with the wind and then be restored or return to our original functioning once the storm is over, that speaks of resiliency. And that's what I see with Ukrainian people.
So how does a clinical psychologist such as yourself advise people who are grieving the loss of loved ones, of property, of normality, and all of that while war is raging all around them? How do you advise them to cope?
Well, it's not so much advice that I give, but rather the training that I'm a part of helps to give people tools like skills acquisition, psychological first aid, if you will, or the ability to understand these are the foundational pillars for mental health. But let's not just, recover from our tragedy. Let's go from strength to strength, because whatever we go through, we can grow through. And everyone's heard of post-traumatic stress disorder, but there's a relatively new field of scientific inquiry called post-traumatic growth, which basically says, well, we can actually not just make a recovery, but go from strength to strength and end up better off in the end than what we were before the tragedy took place. Kind of making true of that age-old Nietzsche quote, that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And so part and parcel of skills acquisition is to teach these core character strengths, understand what they are and how to best apply them in our lives. Things like faith and hope for a future and kindness and gratitude and even courage. The courage to, pick ourselves up, dust ourselves off and go back into battle one more time.
Now, you provided resilience training for representatives of 77 different government departments, but I was fascinated to hear that they also requested you help them with coping when hostilities finally finish, specifically how to channel their anger at the Russians. Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, look, whenever a school or a church or a humanitarian organisation, even the military or the government ask to do post-war training, it tells me that that's the definition of resilience. I'm looking forward. I'm not just looking at my immediate challenges or circumstances. And look, when it comes to hate and anger and resentment, unless, I mean, as we said before, it takes great courage to, for example, forgive. It's almost unthinkable that you would want to forgive, somebody who totally doesn't deserve it. But unless we learn to, well, we run the risk of cultivating the next generation of revenge seekers as the cycle of violence continues. So my role is to simply teach the difference between hurt and hate. Hate, and hurt, they're not the same thing. Hurt comes from travesty and great pain, whereas hate comes from hell. If you wish that somebody would go to hell, well, you pretty much send yourself there at the same time. So we are all about understanding that difference and helping people have a positive outcome, that truly people can hold on to the belief that my tomorrow is going to be better than my today or my yesterday. So it's a good news story.
Dr. Robi, it's great talking to you.